Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining our session this morning. Our Ask the Expert series continues throughout the month of May, and we will be making our plans for our June and July sessions here over the next week. Just as a reminder for some of you that have been joining us and new news for some of you that are new to our Ask the Expert series, all of these are posted on our website. All the recordings will be out there as well. So if you want to go back and listen or share it with someone internally, you can always do that as well. Again, for those of you that have been joining us, I'll do just 3-4 minutes of introductions of Archer and our organization, and very quickly get to our panel and do Q&A. This really is a discussion-based presentation or conversation. For all of you that are on the line, we invite each of you to type some questions. You can ask them in a variety of ways. You can type them in at the bottom, just type in the Q&A section, and we'll ask them anonymously, so you can just type them in. Or you can raise your hand and I can give you the mic and you can ask the question live and have a nice dialogue. Either way, we look forward to fielding your questions. I've got several that have already been sent in via email, so we'll start with those as you all formulate yours. Today's session is really going to be on PRC-5, Requirement 3. And for those of you that have questions there, please type them in. If your question is more related to the other requirements, feel free to type those in as well. We know obviously some of them are very interrelated, so we're happy to have the conversation. So let me just start with maybe just a real quick background on Archer. Archer was created by 4 partners, all of them who have really grown up, if you will, in the utility space. All of them ran large organizations within utilities. 3 of the 4 partners went on to be some of the first auditors in the nation, in the WEC region. We've continued to expand our focus and hiring of talented individuals, but it really started with the core leadership team here at Archer, who really had a vision to be able to bring cybersecurity, compliance, and operational excellence to our clients. Our partners continued to hire and go out and find incredible talent. We've gone after experienced, credentialed, really top-tier talent in not just the industry, but in certain topics as well. So we continue to build our organization and really have a focus on just bringing in the top talent, of which 2 of those folks are on the call with us today. So we'll get right to some introductions. For those of you that I have not met, my name is Mark Brahmstadt. I'll facilitate the session today, but the real knowledge will come from our 2 panelists today, Richard and Jim. So I'll let Richard and Jim introduce themselves. So Richard, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Shifflett. I'm Archer's Director of the O&P practices. You could say my power experience began with the U.S. Navy. I was a nuclear mechanic running propulsion plant aboard submarines in my Navy days. After the Navy, got my engineering degree and ended up at the Bureau of Reclamation in Washington State at the Great Grand Coulee Dam. Left there as a senior electrical engineer, worked with PRC-5 quite a bit, both as a compliance manager for the O&P and SIP standards for 4 years at that 11, and as an electrical engineer doing commissioning, maintenance work on protection systems. After that, I took a job at WEC as a reliability risk engineer, dealing with self-reports, mitigation plans, and helped stood up the inherent risk assessments and internal controls evaluations back in 2014, and then moved into the O&P auditor role and audited PRC-5 on a number of occasions, and eventually moved into the compliance space, which I've been with Archer now for over 2 years. And I'll hand it over to Jim to introduce himself.
Well, good morning or afternoon, whatever the case may be. Jim Turpening here. My career started out in the public utility company over in California. I spent 35 years working there. And primarily my field was, while I was working for the utility company, was working with relay and metering tech for a number of years. From there, I was fortunate enough to be asked to come into the utilities school, and I taught relay and meter techs for a few years. And from there, I had the opportunity to go over to the Energy Control Center, or power supply dispatch center, and had to work, it didn't have to, I got to work there for 9 years as basically a coordinator of projects, as well as the technical relay individual. And yeah, from there, I retired as the superintendent of operation and maintenance for LA and Orange County. And I couldn't just stay home, so they asked me to come and manage the Y2K program for the generation segment in Southern California. From there, I taught internationally for a number of years, thoroughly enjoyed that. And then WEC called and asked if I'd come and help them start up their auditing program. And for somebody that was only supposed to be there for a little while, I spent 9 years there, of which I left, and have had the privilege of being with Archer for the last 2 years. When I was at WEC, I worked primarily with the PRCs and the FAC standards. So this PRC-5 is, like Richard just said, is one of our favorites. So thank you very much, Mark.
Great, thank you. Again, for those of you that are just joining, this is going to be really open dialogue, open Q&A. So for those of you that have not yet typed in any questions, feel free to start typing some questions for the group. I'll kind of facilitate and try and make sure we prioritize the questions accordingly. As I mentioned, I've got a couple that have already been sent in. But Richard, before I jump into the questions, is there anything from a high-level perspective you wanted to maybe just review on requirement 3, or would you prefer just to go to the questions?
Sure. I'll just basically point out some things to be cognizant of as you may have audits coming up, spot checks, or self-certifications. Of course, PRC-5 being one of the most violated standards over the years. Of course, those been in the industry for a while. Remember the version 1 days where you wrote a program and had to follow it, and WEC held you to the fire on that, on your program. Now we're into a phase with PRC-5 where it's more about meeting minimum maintenance tasks in accordance with the maximum maintenance intervals listed in the tables. Made things somewhat simpler in that respect. But as version 2 and version 6 of the standard became implemented, we had this implementation plan to deal with these phased in milestones that have to be met. And when we're dealing with writing RSAWs for upcoming audits and such, demonstrating the usual things such as our maintenance tasks being performed is second hat if you've been around a while, but that implementation milestone piece is sometimes left on the back burner until the last minute. So just a reminder, if you're coming up on an audit within the next year, you might want to start culminating the information to demonstrate the milestones being met for that implementation plan over your audit period, whether that's 3, 6, 9 years, what have you, so that you're not having to fumble at the last minute to demonstrate that you met those milestones. Do you have any high-level stuff, Jim, you want to add?
No, I think that covers it all, Richard. We need to, yeah, I think that'll cover it.
Okay. Well, we'll get the questions, and we'll jump into the questions, and we'll obviously have time at the end as well to summarize. So the first question that came in is, what is your opinion regarding the inclusion of maintenance evidence samples in the RSAW evidence table?
Interesting. So I've seen this on a number of occasions, both as an auditor and as a consultant. It could be a good idea as long as it doesn't turn into a dump trucking situation where we're providing a whole bunch of information as examples. Primarily where I like to see sample evidence used is to help demonstrate to the auditor the format for which the maintenance evidence may be provided in. If your control circuit tests, your relay tests, what have you, are done in a way that's not very evident, pardon the pun, with regards to what's being performed in that documentation, you might provide an example as part of your initial evidence in the RSAW that's highlighted, has text boxes, arrows, what have you, to point out the salient points of the evidence that the auditor will be seeing when they do the random sample, of course, based on your total inventory. So basically, it's not required that you provide those examples or samples, if you will, but if the evidence isn't real clear as to how the tasks are being demonstrated, providing something and then referencing it, of course, from the RSAW narrative would be a good idea. What do you think, Jim?
That's very good, Richard. The highlighting of the evidence and pointing out an example of the process and methodology that's being used in the presentation of the evidence has always helped to the auditors. And I've said this before, I'll say it again, is the auditor is coming into your world, so to speak, and he doesn't understand the way your organization processes things. And so you're presenting your evidence sample in the process that you're familiar with, and it's so helpful for the auditor if those annotations and the items that are highlighted for the samples, it helps educate the auditor as well as allow him the opportunity to go through the evidence as presented. This makes the flow for him much easier. Please don't data dump on him, because that raises his ire.
Sounds like you have experience with that.
Yeah, I won't answer that.
Very good. I'll just jump to the next question. For the inventory spreadsheet that is submitted during an audit, is it possible to combine items to make the spreadsheet more manageable? Richard?
Well, certainly. Having worked for a large generating facility, our maintenance spreadsheet was somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000 line entries. That pales in comparison to some even larger facilities or entities. I think Jim will probably attest to some of the sizable spreadsheets he's seen as well. What we typically see is that when talking about, say, instrument transformers, we'll see them, a set of 3 A, B, and C phase will be lumped together on a single line entry. That's typical. I have seen some entities where they'll split out each phase independently on the line entry. I think that's probably overkill. And then I've seen entities will simply refer to instrument transformers generically to represent all instrument transformers associated with a given BES asset. While that can be done, it's important to communicate to the auditor as part of the RSAW narrative or through some other format, just how that line entry is representing the given components that are applicable to the standard. Other cases where you could combine line items may have to do with your control circuits and the way that they're tested, maintained. Especially if you're not doing segmented testing, because segmented testing, it gets a bit more convoluted with regards to how that's demonstrated. But if it's just a single trip path, you can possibly lump not only the control circuit, but the breaker trip coil and or lockout device, if it's applicable, into the same line entry. But again, if in those cases where you lump components together, be sure to communicate that to the auditor in some fashion before they receive or as part of the reception of that spreadsheet. Jim?
Yeah, very, very well put. the CTs sometimes can be a little bit of an issue when they do them random number selection when you're trying to verify maintenance procedures and the maintenance dates. Is the sometimes you get an inordinate number of individual CTs, PTs, and so then the auditor has to go back and has to filter a little of that out so that he gets a better cross section of the protection that he's doing. So I totally agree. An example of your circuitry, your control circuitry, and a statement as to how that function is performed and completed is always an asset during the audit period. Mark?
Very good, thank you. Let's see, we'll go to this question. For instrument transformer verifications, are 0 values acceptable for neutral CTs?
That's a bit of a trick question. So yes and no. So let me provide an example. Let's say we've got a power transformer with a neutral CT, and of course during normal power operations, balanced loads that you would expect 0 current to be passing through the neutral. So when you're doing your instrument transformer verifications, of course you want to verify that the signal being sent by the instrument transformer is received at the relay. Well, if you go to the relay, you can measure the current, but of course it's going to be 0. In the case of these modern microprocessor relays, they're capable of doing calculations based on the 3-phase currents and voltages to determine that residual ground current. And it's possible to capture the current being measured by the instrument, by the relay, which will be 0, of course. But as part of that output, the relay will also give the residual currents that it's calculating based upon in-service quantities. And having both that information and the fact that you measured 0 current, we feel is sufficient evidence as long as one backs up the other. Lacking that, say your protection relay doesn't have that calculation capability, or it's an old electromechanical or solid state, of course, there's no way to directly or automatically, I should say, calculate those values. You might be able to do so manually based on live voltages and currents that you record and then calculate subsequently. Alternatively, of course, you can take the system offline and do primary injection is a method I've seen used where they'll inject a current on the primary side of the instrument transformer which causes a secondary current to be generated, and then measure that at the relay. So you're simulating an online situation. And by doing so, you've verified that the instrument transformer sends a signal and it receives at the relay. Jim, what do you have?
Excellent. There's not much more I can add, because if you, the ultimate test, of course, is like Richard just said, if we can push a primary current across that CT and then measure it at the relay, that's a positive way to do that. With the equipment that we have today, the relays can calculate that neutral current. There have been occasions, and I do mean just occasions, to where they have submitted, the entity has submitted a reading at the relay with an extremely sensitive meter, and they read milliamps, so to speak, as a result of the unbalance. But that's not very commonly practiced. I've seen it a couple of times. So I agree with Richard. If the new relays, if you've got those new relays, they do that calculation for you, and you can take that. So other than that, it's a little bit of a touchy question, and because it could go either way. So if it can be calculated at the relay, that will be sufficient. The other extremely positive way is if you could get the transformer bank normally where this occurs, get that offline, and then while it's offline, push a primary current across that CT and then read the resultant current to the ratio of the transformer at the relay, and note it and note that in your evidence package is more than sufficient. Thank you, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Richard. Before I read the next question, I noticed we've had several more individuals join, so welcome. Just as a side note, don't hesitate to start typing your questions in at the bottom. You can type in the Q&A, or you can simply click on the raise hand button, and we'll allow you to ask it live as well. So next question. For components that are continuously monitored, are the component schematics sufficient evidence for monitoring? Richard?
Sure. Yes, they could be needed to demonstrate monitoring. A lot depends upon the context there. Of course, it depends upon what kind of component we're talking about too. Let's take into, for example, we're talking about a protective relay that's being continuously monitored. Typically that involves some stuff that goes on inside the relay. That's a self-diagnostics that are occurring, and the relay will trigger an output contact to send an alarm off. So that's part of its programming. It's important and therefore to have the manufacturer's information that demonstrates what its self-diagnostic is doing and when it alarms. And then the schematics come in handy to demonstrate how that alarm contact gets delivered to a point at which is monitored and corrective actions can be administered. And that, I think, is where the schematics are important, but don't miss the piece with regards to the manufacturer's information too. If we're talking about other types of components that are being continuously monitored, batteries are another one that's commonly seen, where there'll be some sort of battery device. Again, we would like to see a schematic to represent how the alarm is being delivered to your system for corrective action to be taken. If it's a discrete device, the schematic might also indicate how the device functions to continuously monitor an aspect of the battery. So the schematic could have dual purpose, but otherwise manufacturer's information would also be helpful. Jim?
Yeah, the alarming, excuse me, I had a frog in my throat. The alarming schematic is of paramount of importance, and notations that the alarm where it is being sent is received, and that action will be taken on the alarm when it's received. The different types of alarms that these devices have, be they the new modern devices they have where they monitor the power supply and everything else, that the frequency, the voltage levels and such as that, that is of paramount of importance in today. But those that do not have that, such as Richard mentioned in the battery chargers, batteries themselves, those alarms are something that the auditors will key in on, because the battery is of such ultimate importance to a particular substation itself. So giving the auditor the information of what the communication is, what the process is, should an alarm arise, it is a handy thing to note in the section when we start talking about the communication systems and the alarming systems, such as that. This is a case where you really can't overkill this. Very good. Mark?
Thank you, guys. Let's see. Let's go to this one's specific to a wind farm. For a wind farm facility, are the protection systems on the collector strings in scope for the standard? Richard, I know you've been having some fun with some wind farms recently, so you want to take that one?
Sure. So yeah, this is we have to look at the definition of BES here. when we're looking at dispersed power resources, the BES definition states the individual generators are part of the BES, and then the point at which aggregation occurs where you have greater than 75 MVA. So if a given collector string has less than 75 MVA across it, then it's not part of the BES and may be excluded from PRC-5, unless the protection implied or that's applied to that collector string somehow impacts directly the aggregation point at which 75 MVA occurs. But generally, my experience has been the collector strings are less than 75 MVA, and where we see the protections coming into scope for PRC-5 is at that concentration point of the collector strings. Usually the first concentration point, it's a collector bus, if you will, and the protections applied there. Jim?
There's not a whole lot I can add to that, Richard. I think that's been clearly stated. I really can't add to that. Very good.
Great, thank you. We're down to the last question or two, so if any of our attendees have any more questions, feel free to type them in and we'll get through these, and then we'll do a quick roundtable with the two gentlemen as well. And again, if it's not on requirement 3 and you want to ask it on at one of the different requirements, please feel free. We use segmented testing of control circuits due to certain bus differential protection schemes. How should these segments be listed in the PRC-5 spreadsheet at audit?
So yeah, this is something that I've run into before, both as an auditor and as a consultant, where an entity may list a control circuit being tested, but come to find out after a random sample has been performed that they use a segmented approach and did one segment at one time, did another segment another time. And it gets a bit problematic when we start looking at the dates there as to tracking to make sure that we don't exceed a maintenance interval. So our recommendation is, in the case where you're using segmented testing, so we're testing basically, let's say we've got as the question I think refers to a bus differential. We have a bus differential scheme where we got several breakers and you've got a relay that's looking for differential across the bus. And if it senses differential, it's going to trip all the breakers at once. You obviously, when you test that, you don't want to trip your entire facility. So you do a segmented approach, maybe given a certain outage period in a bay, you might do that particular segment of the differential trip and then do the other segments as those outages occur. When it comes to documenting that in the spreadsheet, we recommend that you do so individually and somehow identify them uniquely as to which part of the segment you're referring to, both for your benefit and the auditors, so that we can both reference it properly. And then the dates would correspond, of course, to each segmented test date, and those can be tracked independently to make sure that neither one of them or none of them exceed the minimum or maximum maintenance intervals. Jim?
I totally agree. I don't know what else I could add other than this is why it's so important that prior to the audit that a system single line is sent for the BES facilities so that the auditor can get a picture of exactly what the segmentation of the testing is or control circuitry review. It's very important. I don't know other than just make sure that it's noted in the evidence package so that the auditor doesn't have to ask the questions, what do these two dates mean for a particular bus? So yeah, that's it. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you. We have another question that just came in, so I'll read that one as well. We have a black start unit with 12 MVA, 13.8 kV generator, and 13.8 69K step-up transformer. Does Mod 25-2 and PRC 24-2 include black start unit of this size? Richard, are you on mute by chance?
Of course I am. Sorry about that. So in this case, we're talking about a unit that's less than 20 MVA, so it doesn't meet the BES criteria. So in the context of talking about PRC-5, of course, we wouldn't be looking at protection systems associated with that device. However, the question is more related to other standards, specifically Mod 25 and PRC-24. For Mod 25, it's generator testing real and reactive power capabilities. And this is testing associated with a BES generation. So this small unit, even though it is black start, oh shoot, I'm probably gonna get myself wrong here. My initial take is that it's probably not applicable, but I'm gonna pull up Mod 25 while we're talking and make sure I'm not getting that wrong. Pardon me that I'm, of course, not prepared for Mod 25 in this discussion, but it would just take me a moment.
No worries, thanks for doing that.
Okay, I just did a keyword search in Mod 25, there's no mention of black start. So yeah, if it's not BES, then I don't expect a Mod 25 testing to be performed. PRC-24, likewise, we're dealing with BES generation. PRC-24, in that standard, let's make sure I get that right. Yeah, we're talking about generator frequency and voltage protection specifically. And those are pointed to, as far as the applicability goes, to generator owners, but those are the generators that are part of the BES. Again, here there's no specific mention of black start within the standard as part of being applicable. And so hopefully that answers the question. Jim, do you have anything to add?
No, I can't add to that. That's exactly what I would have put out. Mark?
Wonderful. I think we've hit our last question. So at this point, I'll ask Jim for you first, and then Richard, if you want to just take a few minutes. And is there anything we didn't talk about today that you want to just make sure folks walk away here, or that maybe you thought would get asked and didn't, so we can maybe answer it proactively? And then if any other questions come up, I'll let you guys know. But Jim, I'll let you go first.
Before we do that, real quick, there was a question posed to chat, not into the Q&A. I don't know if you saw that, Mark. Can we address that?
I did not see that, so thank you for letting me know that. So I'll read it and then go from there. If using example maintenance records in RSAW, does it have to be for an actual device within the audit period, or can a blank one be used? And my apologies for almost missing that.
That's a good question. With regards to we were talking at the beginning about using sample evidence to help explain the format you use as part of your maintenance testing. I've seen it done both ways, but most of the time it's using actual data. Whether it's actually in the audit period or not, I don't think makes a difference, because what we're trying to communicate is the format for which the auditor is going to be seeing the data. And it can be blank as well, as long as the way you annotate it as such makes it clear that this blank area may be where the data is going to be populated, or this is where you would expect this test evidence to appear, something along those lines. So I don't know that I have a preference one or over the other per se, but Jim, what do you think?
No, I don't have a preference. I agree, one over the other. It's no, I totally agree, Richard. As many audits as I've done on PRC-5, I agree. Okay, Mark?
Wonderful, thank you. Now I think that is all the questions, so my apologies for almost missing that one. Oh, we got another one in maybe. Yep, here's one more. If using example maintenance records in RSAW, does it have to be for an actual device? Oh, nope, I think that one just came in. Sorry, it just was retyped, so my apologies. So I think we're good. That's the last of the questions. So Jim, I will flip it over to you to talk through anything you'd like, and then over to Richard.
Okay, and having done, I don't know if I've done 100 PRC-5 audits, but close to it. The one thing I would suggest to all entities, and it's a simplified statement, and that is to remember that the auditor is coming in and learning in a short period of time your organization, the acronyms that you use, as well as the methodology that is used for your assembly of all of your evidence and your data. So be sure when you do assemble this that you have clear instructions and examples as to what the evidence that we're giving to the auditors in a way that they is easily understood and easily manipulated for the verification of all of your evidence. These auditors, having been one and knowing them for quite a while, they're normally a pretty good bunch of guys, but they are able to go through the evidence and pick out that evidence that is important to them to show compliance and to have verification that the evidence you've presented from your particular entity is meeting and the standards and the intent of the language of the standard. So that's about the only advice I really have. Richard?
Well, of course, we could probably wax on for hours if we got off into the technical details of maintenance evidence and such, but that's perhaps a discussion for another time. I realize that, when we're talking about NERC compliance, we got folks that are not technical, that are having to deal with these spreadsheets that the regions require at audit. We're dealing with maintenance records they may not necessarily understand as far as how the information or what the information contained within is demonstrating. So it's very important, of course, that those technical folks do a review of the information to make sure that the information before it gets to the auditors is vetted and that everything is demonstrated. But if possible, for the non-technical compliance folks, maybe spend some time with the engineers or the technicians to understand how their templated data is presenting the evidence. You may not necessarily know how all the numbers are computed or were used to demonstrate the maintenance being performed, but if you can at least be educated as to how the information is presented in the data being provided, you might also be able to speak to it at audit, or when you're looking at the records, may be able to catch some glitches that may have been missed along the way. That's about all I've got, Mark. Oh, looks like we got another question.
Yeah, perfect. We'll go ahead and take that one then. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jim. Phased implementations, 40, 60, 80, 100%. Does it require to provide the percent completed, example 40%, if that falls before this audit period?
Okay, so I'll restate the question, make sure that I got it right. So let's take the scenario where I've got a 3-year audit period. So this is 2020, and then at some time before 2017, we had this 40% milestone, let's say. Do you have to demonstrate that you met that 40% milestone since it was before the audit period? My answer would be no, but that might be captured through another milestone that occurs during the audit period. For example, if it's the 60% threshold. So initially, the auditor is going to look at the milestones within the audit period. If there is reason to doubt that those milestones are met, then they may go back before the audit period and look, okay, was that 40% milestone met since you didn't meet this other one? So initially, the stuff outside the audit period is not going to be looked at. But if there are red flags start coming up about meeting the current milestones, the auditors, as part of their responsibilities, is to find out where the non-compliance starts. So they're going to start backing up, and it may go well past the beginning of the audit period. Jim, what do you have to add?
Well, that's excellent. Once the red flag goes up, the auditors will start to dig and verify that in fact there was compliance, and they will dig until they, until we find that compliance has been met. So in answer to the question, yes. Very good, Richard. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm just making one last survey here to see if there's any other questions. I think we closed them all out. So for everyone that's on the phone, you can see my email address. This is Mark again on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Feel free to take down that email address, and if there's a question that comes up after the session, or if you have someone that's listening to the recording and you'd like to ask a question, you can always send me an email, and I will make sure that we get one of our experts to answer the question and get a response back to you. So thank you guys all for your time today. We've got another session on Thursday on FAC 8. So hopefully many of you will join us for that one as well. All the recordings and registration opportunities are all posted on our website under our events tab. Thank you guys very much for your time. Have a great day, and everyone stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Goodbye, all.
Bye, everyone.